Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beastly Talks. I'm your host, Stian Helling, and this is going to be quite a dense podcast, so I am going to get stuck right into it. Um, I it's very important for me, especially when I'm working with clients, or whether I'm working with new dog owners or whatever it may be, or even students, that they have a really good understanding of all the basics of learning theory. Now, I know some people don't really appreciate theory and they think that's boring. And, I hated theory when I when I was in school, when I was a little kid. But as I've gotten older, I've actually started to appreciate theory more. And I guess the way that I came into dogs was a little bit backwards because I got a dog. I got two dogs, in fact, and I had no idea what I was doing, and I messed up a lot of things. And then we started fostering dogs, and suddenly I had dogs getting sent to my house that had out of control drive levels and reactivity levels, and even dogs that were aggressive towards us. So most people, they kind of learn about dog training. They get a dog, they do some classes, they get interested, they want to learn more, they start volunteering, and they kind of learn from the base up. Me, on the other hand, I ended up just having aggressive dogs in my house that I didn't know anything about, and I had to work it out backwards. And so when I actually did NDTF and got my education in dog training, what happened was suddenly I had a whole different understanding of what I had been doing, the things that had been working and why they had been working, but also the things that hadn't been working and why they weren't working. And so to me, having that baseline understanding of learning theory and actually knowing why we do the things that we do is super important to me. So again, it's going to be a little bit heavy on the science side, but hopefully it'll be interesting enough for everyone to sit down, listen through. I'm going to try and make this as fun as I can. Um, but yeah, learning to understand the basics is actually super important, especially if you want to get into dog training and you want to really understand it properly. Now, when we start talking about learning theory, especially being a dog training podcast, um, people tend to think that this stuff only applies to dogs, but it doesn't. It actually applies to everything. Um, Essentially, every living, thinking, feeling being can learn from these things, and it operates in the same way with people as it does with dogs, as it does with mice, right? A lot of this learning theory was originally it originally came about by studying mice, right? And then we initially we essentially just upscale them into different animals, and now we train orcas with the same kind of principle of learning theory that we train dogs with. So this isn't just some kind of narrow-minded dog training thing. This actually applies to everything. And as we get a little bit more into it, I'll elaborate on that as well. But I want to start with the super easy stuff, and that is what we call the 4 stages of learning. So whenever you're learning anything new, there are essentially 4 stages to that learning process. And it is what we call acquisition, fluency, generalization, and maintenance. So to break these down, acquisition means you're acquiring a new skill. So in a dog's case, for example, say I have a dog that doesn't know how to sit, I am then going to start teaching the dog the behavior of putting its bum on the ground. And over time, the dog's going to learn that sit means put your bum on the ground. And now the dog has acquired a brand new skill. Now, when the dog has acquisition, that's when we move into the fluency bit. So now we start practicing it more and more, and we get better and better at it, and we refine and we tune the behavior to the exact way that we want it to look and the exact speed that we want it to happen at, etc., etc. And so we get to a point where the dog now has a very strong, very clear behavior every time we give a cue to the dog. Now, when we move into the generalization bit, that's when we actually move out of our training facility and we start teaching the dog that this behavior actually applies in other places as well. So I think I mentioned this in the previous podcast, but dogs tend to think in pictures. They don't think in words like we do. So us humans, if we need to explain, like if we need someone to understand the concept, we use a lot of words. We use a lot of explaining, and we relate it to other things, right? We try and we utilize our words to make it as clear as possible to the other human being. But for dogs, they see this more from a picture point of view. And so what I mean by that is if I teach my dog to sit inside the house, I can I create a very clear picture for the dog. It is a specific behavior in a specific location. And again, many people come to me and they say like, "Hey, my dog knows how to sit, knows how to drop, knows how to give paw, knows all these cool things inside the house, but the second we leave the house, he doesn't know them." And that means you have not generalized the behavior. So what generalization actually means is once we have acquisition and fluency of a behavior in a controlled environment, we then start taking the dog out to new environment. And at this point, we have to retrain the behavior. But the dog should work it out much quicker. So say, for example, just to throw some random numbers out there, say it's taken me 100 repetitions to teach a new dog to sit inside my house, right? Now, at this point, whenever I say sit, the dog sits very quickly. He sits in the position that I want him to, and he straightens his body the way that I want him to, etc., etc. So that is taking roughly 100 repetitions. But now I go outside the house and I go down to the driveway. And now I ask the dog to sit, and very often the dog will be confused because he has learned to sit in a very specific area, but he hasn't learned to sit outside of that area. So now I have to break out some food again, and I have to go, hey, actually, I'm going to just retrain you in this situation. That sit means sit here as well. But at this point, the dog should realize very quickly that, oh, that behavior that we just finished learning, or you want me to do the same thing here, right? So now the next time around, it might only take 20 repetitions for the dog to go, oh, okay, sit means sit here as well. Then we go to a more distracting environment. And now we ask the dog to sit, and the dog goes, I don't know what that means, because he hasn't learned it when you're at a market, for example. People coming and going, other dogs is barking, there's birds flying around. And so now we have to break out some food. We have to train it all over again. But again, every time you retrain it in a new place, what happens is the dog should pick up on the behavior quicker in that new situation. And over time, they will generalize, meaning sit means sit no matter where we are. So that's the generalization aspect of training behaviors. And then finally, we get to maintenance. Now, when we have a dog that understands the behavior and has good generalization, what we want to do at this point is we want to start fading out the reinforcer, right? And most of the time we use food as a reinforcer in these things, right? So now I want to start teaching the dog, hey, I'm not always going to have food with me, but the behavior applies anyway. So whether I have a treat pouch or not, when I say sit, I need you to sit. And over time, we get to a point where the dog will comply, whether or not we have something to offer the dog. But if I ask my dog then to sit 100 times in 100 different locations and I never reinforce him, what's going to happen is over time that behavior is going to start to dissipate. It is going to begin going away. And so that's where we reach the maintenance phase. So all behaviors have to be maintained to a certain degree. And that kind of it depends on how much you need to maintain them. That depends on the early learning for the dog. It depends on the dog's drive to actually do things and have fun with you. But pretty much any dog, once in a while, you're still going to have to break out a bowl. You're going to have to break out some food and you have to go, hey, I've asked you to sit 20 times now and I haven't given you anything for it. You have complied, which I'm happy with. But now I'm just going to give you a quick reinforcer to kind of remind you, hey, you are doing the right thing and I want you to keep going. But this is, yeah, so the maintenance is for the dog's life, essentially. But the more ingrained the behavior becomes, the more of an understanding the dog has, the less you should have to maintain the behavior. So those are the 4 stages of learning: acquisition, we learn something new; fluency, we become proficient in it; generalization, um, we generalize. This applies to everything, everywhere, all the time. And finally, maintenance, where we just have to remind the dog that, hey, you are doing the right thing, and I do like it when you do this, and I need you to continue on. Now, in terms of from a human perspective, I like to think a lot of these things in terms of learning a new language. So, being Norwegian, obviously, I speak Norwegian and I understand Danish and Swedish. These languages are kind of given to us for free. Now, I have a little bit of an understanding of German, not to a point where I can have a conversation or anything, but obviously, my secondary language is English. And the way that I learned how to speak English is I learned by acquiring a brand new skill first. Had to learn every single word of English and the Norwegian meaning applied to it. Then I have to learn how verbs change and where they sit, and we break it all down to these super complex, minute details that create the full language. Right? So acquisition would be you learn all the words. The fluency becomes when you start creating sentences and understanding cultural effects on the language, and how the verb sits before the this and the that, and how that changes the end of the sentence, whatever it may be. But you become fluent in the language. Now, the generalization aspect comes where I travel to another country and I start speaking the language there. So I might have perfect grammar and everything, but I have a really weird accent, right? So people may have trouble understanding me because American sounds so different from British, from Irish, from Australian, and so on and so forth. And so now we can learn to pick up different accents in different places, and we learn to generalize the language that we've actually learned. And we learn to mimic it in different settings so it becomes easier for everyone to speak the same language. And then finally, we have to maintain the language. Meaning, if I moved back to Norway now and I never read or spoke or heard a single word of English for the next 10 years, my knowledge of English would regress massively. Right. And so that means even if we know a language, once in a while we have to practice it. We have to watch a movie in that language. We have to speak to someone that speaks that language, etc., etc. And so this is how the 4 stages of learning actually apply to what we do as humans as well. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense to you all. All right. Next up in our little nerd chat here today is what we call classical conditioning, or it's also called Pavlovian conditioning. So, a lot of you may be familiar with the name Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs, more importantly. That's where the idea of classical conditioning came from, and I'll talk you through what that means. But at the end of the day, what Pavlovian conditioning is learning by association. So we take something that has no meaning to us and then we ascribe some form of value to it, and over time the two become interconnected, just innately. And so Pavlov was a Russian scientist, and there are a lot of ideas around what Pavlov was actually studying. Some people say he was studying um, dogs' digestive systems and were looking for enzymes in their saliva. And other people say that he was studying torture methods. So I don't actually know what the true answer is, but what happened was Pablo had a whole bunch of dogs, and they did various experiments with them. And what they found over time was that the dogs got to a point, because they were in a very confined area, and all the people that came in to feed the dogs at the end of the day, they were always wearing white, lab coats, essentially. And over time, what happened was every time someone in a white lab coat walked into the room, the dogs began salivating. And so Pavlo then became interested in this and started studying how the white lab coats began predicting food. And so food to a dog is what we call an unconditioned stimulus. It means something that the dog doesn't have to learn in order for it to have some kind of value, right? Food's food, food keeps us alive, gives us energy, and that's not something we have to learn. That is something we know from the day that we're born, right? Now, we then take what we call a neutral stimulus, so something that means nothing to the dog. And when we present the dog with a neutral stimulus, the thing that means nothing, followed within, I think, the general consensus between 1.2 and 1.6 seconds, we follow up with the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that inherently means something to the dog. We pair those two together for long enough, and what happens is we end up having a conditioned stimulus. Hopefully, you're still with me on this. I'll give you some examples and make it make a little bit more sense. But in the case of dog training, the easiest way to explain this is clicker training. So we have what we call a clicker, which is basically a plastic holder with a metal plate inside, and when we click a button, it makes a very sharp sound, like a loud metallic click sound. Now, that metallic clicking sound is a neutral stimulus to the dog, meaning it means absolutely nothing to the dog. It just hears a click. You can click that thing 100 times, and the dog's just going to walk off and go, I'm just going to go and sniff something over here. Now, if at this point I break out some high value food, something that the dog loves to eat, what I can do now is I can press the clicker, which makes the metallic click sound. That is the neutral stimulus. And then I present the food to the dog within 1 to 2 seconds, and the dog eats the food. That is the unconditioned stimulus, meaning the dog knows that food is good for it. Now I rinse and repeat. So I go click, food, click, food, click, food. We do that many, 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 many times. And what happens is the dog learns that the click means food is coming. Now the clicker, the neutral stimulus that meant nothing before, becomes a conditioned stimulus, because the dog hears the click, and because it has been followed with the food so many times afterwards, the dog goes, click means food's coming, I gotta run back to my human. That's what we call a marker or a condition reinforcer. We're going to get back to that a little bit later. But that's essentially how we take something that means nothing and we ascribe a value to it. Now, you can apply this to so many things. And again, let's go back to the learning a new language thing. If you're listening to this and you don't speak Norwegian, if I now say a Norwegian word, that's not going to mean anything to you. Løp. Løp, løp, løp. Right? I can say that a million times. And if you don't speak Norwegian or you don't understand Norwegian, these things are not going to mean anything to you. However, if I begin repeating the neutral stimulus, the word løp, with the stimulus that you've already learned, which means run, now we start pairing those two together. So I say løp, run, løp, run, løp, run. We rinse and repeat that many enough times, and what happens is you go, fuck me, I think løp means run, right? That's essentially how we begin learning a new language. We have to learn the words before we can learn the intricacies of how the language operates and how the grammar works for that particular language. But this, again, it's learning by association. Now, I don't know if there's anyone out there who enjoys a drink like I do. However, if you do, and particularly if you are a fan of the French thing called champagne, right? I think this is a good example. A lot of people like champagne. Now, the one thing that champagne has that a lot of other drinks don't have is a very distinctive popping sound when the cork blows. So now you unwind the metal top, you take that off, you push the bottom of the cork, and it goes pop. Now, because you over time have paired that sound with the flavor of champagne, what is eventually going to happen is when you hear the pop, you're going to taste the champagne, even though you're not drinking it. And this is an important thing because over time, true classical conditioning should become reflexive. And that means you have no control over the reaction that you have to the conditioned stimulus. So when I hear that pop, I taste champagne. I have no control over that. It's not something I imagine in my head to be happening. It's something that happens reflexively because I've had enough pairings of those two together to the point where my body just goes, hey, that popping sound has to produce just an innate sensation in my body, which is the taste of champagne. Now, true classical conditioning is so powerful, it's potentially dangerous. Because if you have a huge consequence that gets linked to something specific, that can create lifelong problems for a dog or for a human. And so in the case of a dog, if you have a young puppy that gets attacked by a dog, that gets bitten by a dog, gets injured by them, that huge event, what we call a single learning event, can create a classically conditioned fear response in a puppy that will last for a lifetime of that dog. Because every time that puppy, as it grows older, every time it sees a dog, the only thing that happens in its mind is it essentially feels the pain of being attacked. And so it goes, dogs are bad because they cause me pain. And this is very often the starting point of a lot of reactivity and aggression cases towards other dogs. To relate it more to a human sensation, this isn't a very nice story, but I think it illustrates the point really well. So when I was a very young man, around 16 or 17 years old, I can't remember exactly, I lived in a small town in Norway called Gol. Had about 4,000 people living there at the time. And it's one of those places where everyone just fucking knows everyone. You might not know them, you might not go to the pub with them or have a conversation with them, but you know who they are, you know what they do, etc., etc. Now, around the time when I was 16, 17 years old, what happened is we had a massive incident in this tiny little community where five people, five young kids, well, not kids, but yeah, they were from 18 to, I believe, 15 years old at the time, were in a car doing some joyriding at late night, and the car got hit by a train, and it killed all five people in the car. It was a massive, huge tragedy. And for weeks and weeks after, it was the only thing that was talked about in newspapers everywhere. And, the horrible accident and the loss of these lives of these young kids led to, politicians talking about, do we have to change how we operate train lines? And it just became this insanely dragged out, long, and intensely emotional experience. Now, at the time of recording this, I'm 44 years old, so it is quite a long time since this happened. Still, to this day, every time I drive over a train track, my body tenses. Now, I wasn't part of the accident at all. I was fast asleep when the accident happened. But because it had such an imprinted learning on me, because it was such an aversive event, and because I understand that we have to drive over train tracks from time to time because there are no under or overpasses, every time I drive over a train track, my body tenses without me thinking about it, because those two things are so innately linked together. And and don't get me wrong, if I can think about, when I see a train track coming, I can actually think about, okay, here comes the train track, right? And I can subdue the natural response that I have. Now, this is something that dogs are not quite as good at as we are, which is why it takes longer to deal with intense learning behaviors from a Pavlovian sense than it can take with people. But again, people who have experienced massive trauma as young kids, that trauma will often stick with them for life. And that is the bad side of classical conditioning. If we can control it, if we can utilize it, it is so incredibly powerful. However, if it goes wrong, it can cause a hell of a lot of problems. All right, so that brings us away from one of the most primary ways that we learn something. Again, Pavlovian conditioning, learn through by association, but that brings us in to the other side of things, where we learn behaviors through consequences. And that's what we call operant conditioning. So, operant conditioning came from a guy called B.F. Skinner. He was studying rats in a laboratory, and what he was actually looking for is whether we could encourage a rat to perform a specific behavior in order to avoid or acquire a specific consequence. And so this is what led us to the basic operant knowledge of reinforcement and punishment. Now, a lot of people take issue with the word punishment, and honestly, that's just because they don't really understand it. Because reinforcement, by definition, means to increase the frequency, intensity, and likelihood of a behavior happening again, whereas punishment means to reduce the frequency and intensity and likelihood of a behavior happening again. That's it. Those are the basic definition of reinforcement and punishment. Now, what Skinner found was that there were essentially four quadrants of operant learning. And so that was, we have reinforcement to increase behavior on one side, we have punishment to decrease behavior on the other side. Now, both reinforcement and punishment now comes in the form of what we call positive and negative. Now, it's very important to understand that positive and negative in this situation is not based on your emotional response. It's not having a good or a bad experience. It means we add a stimulus or we take away a stimulus. So it's mathematical. So positive is actually plus. It's not whether or not you have a positive experience, whether or not we add something. Whereas oh god, negative, sorry, I had a brain block there for a second, whereas negative is, represented as a minus, where we take something away. So, when we start putting these together into the 4 quadrants, what we end up getting is we have positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement means I add something, we call appetitive. So, I should probably go into this first, actually. So, the way that we motivate a dog, or we are motivated by something, is by what we call an appetitive or an aversive stimuli. So, an appetitive stimuli means something that is pleasant, something that the individual finds pleasant and wants to seek out. Whereas aversive means a stimulus that the individual finds unpleasant and they try to avoid. Yep. And so now we have positive reinforcement means I add something appetitive. So I essentially give the dog something the dog wants when it conducts a specific behavior, linking the two together and making that particular behavior more likely to happen again. And so at the end of the day, this is, pretty much how we teach everything new. If I have a puppy that doesn't know how to sit, well, most puppies love food, right? If they have a certain level of food, right? And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a handful of nice treats and I'm going to lift those treats over the puppy's head. When the nose goes up towards the food, the bum's going to go down. And when the bum hits the ground, I give the reinforcer, the positive reinforcement to the dog, making the behavior of sitting more likely to happen again in the future. Now, rinse and repeat this 100 times. Then we start adding a word. So we add in the classical conditioning part to the point. So now every time I lift my hand, the puppy looks at that and goes, oh, that's a signal for me to put my bum on the ground. Now, when the dog understands that me lifting my hand is a signal to them to put their bum on the ground, and then a positive reinforcement is delivered, what I can do now from a classical conditioning point of view is I can preface my lifting of the hand by saying the word sit. So now the sequence becomes sit, lift my hand, puppy's bum hits the ground, I give the puppy a treat when the bum has hit the ground. This is learning through positive reinforcement. So every time the dog does something we like, we give the dog something they like. Right? Now, things that we can add to create reinforcement, well, food is the most common thing that we find these days. But interestingly, more and more importantly, we're finding that play is also becoming a much more valuable reinforcer. But other things that we can use to create reinforcement can be pats or it can be praise. Some dogs that aren't particularly food or play driven might love being told they're a good girl and get a pat on their belly, right? Whatever is reinforcing or repetitive to that dog, we can link with the behavior and increase the frequency and intensity and likelihood of that behavior happening again. Now, on the flip side of that, we have what we call positive punishment. So positive punishment means I add something aversive, something unpleasant when the dog conducts a specific behavior in order to punish that behavior to make it less likely to happen again in the future. And so things that we can add to create punishment can be a loud sound, right? A lot of dogs are quite sound sensitive, And essentially, the way that I teach a puppy the word no is I'll say no loud and clear when they're about to do something naughty, like bite my couch. I say the word no loud and clear, and then I clap my hands together, making a loud interruptive sound that makes the puppy, stop what it's doing. Now, I think it's worth jumping in here just for a second before I continue explaining the full range of operant conditioning. But the word punishment is so tainted and misunderstood in this day and age that it's actually worth just going a little bit more into what punishment actually is. Um, and like I was saying before, punishment is literally just some form of stimuli that decreases the frequency and intensity and likelihood of behavior happening again. Now, what's happened, especially in dog training, is the people that are anti-tools and anti the use of corrections and punishments are trying to just by default equate punishment to brutalization. And that is just not the case. Again, a loud sound, like me clapping my hands, that snaps a dog out of doing something that I don't want him to do, is a punishment. Is that cruel or brutal? No, absolutely not. It is just a thing that the dog finds aversive to a point, which interrupts the behavior that they're conducting and makes it less likely to happen again in the future. That's it. Um, Now, on that though, there are shitty trainers out there. There are people that are just cruel and horrible people that do things to dogs we shouldn't be doing to dogs. But that doesn't mean that punishment, the concept of punishment to reduce a behavior in and of itself, is cruel or brutal in any way, form, or shape. Um, and again, we'll get to talk much more about punishment in the future because it is an incredibly important thing to really understand and to understand how to use properly. Because if it's used incorrectly, like anything, it becomes a problem. But in this day and age, when so many people are trying to outlaw the very idea of punishment, um, very few people are talking about it, and that just means more people are using it incorrectly and actually creating more problems than they're fixing through the use of proper punishment. So sorry for going off on a tangent there, but back to positive punishment. So the adding of an aversive stimuli in order to stop behavior from happening. So again, we've mentioned the loud sound. It can be a leash correction, so like a quick snap of tug of the leash in order to kind of tap the dog on the shoulder, tap, tap, and say, hey, cut that out. It can be a high stimulation on an electric collar. It can be a squirt with a water bottle, right? Whatever the dog finds aversive. And we'll get back to the squirt with the water bottle a little bit later because it's important to understand that we need to find out what's aversive and what's appetitive to our dogs. But let's sit on that for a little bit. Then we have negative punishment. Negative punishment means I take something away from the dog that's appetitive to the dog. It's something they like. Or I remove the dog from a situation that they want to be in that they find pleasing. Probably the most common example is you have a dog that gets super excited when guests come to the door, right? You have a friendly, I don't know, golden retriever or something, and there's a knock on the door, and that has classically been conditioned into the dog to mean someone's at the door. Now, if that dog likes people and they find people appetitive, the dog's going to get super excited, it's going to run to the door. Now, we then go and open the door, and the dog gets overexcited and it conducts a behavior. So it jumps up on the person, which is a very natural response in dogs in order to elicit some form of attention from the human being. Now, if we don't want our dogs to jump at people, what we might do at that point is we might grab the dog by the collar and we move them into the bathroom, or we move them outside and we shut the door. So a timeout would be a negative punishment because I'm taking the dog away from something that it finds pleasant or exciting or reinforcing in some way, form, or shape. A lot of people talk about withholding food. So you hold a handful of food out to the dog, and the dog conducts the wrong behaviors. We take the food away. I'm not going to give you positive reinforcement. In fact, I'm going to negatively punish you for not completing the behavior. Now, I've had a discussion with many people about this, but at the end of the day, in order to create true negative punishment, you have to essentially take the dog away from something it already has. Because withholding something is more likely to create barrier frustration, a whole different concept that we can explore further down the track of this podcast. But essentially, if I have something, the dog doesn't have it yet, I take it away. Is that by definition negative punishment? A lot of people would argue that it is. I would argue that it's not. But we're here to learn about the basic science of learning theory, not to have in-depth discussions about definitions. Then we have the last one, and this is the one that people tend to have so much trouble wrapping their heads around. I have hopefully a good way of explaining it to you so that it'll make a little bit more sense. But yeah, this quadrant, the last quadrant, is the one that tends to really mess with people's heads. So, negative reinforcement. And this is one of the things that I work a lot with. And I do work primarily with positive reinforcement, but unfortunately, by the time a lot of dogs come to me for training, positive reinforcement isn't really an option anymore because they're either too aggressive to accept anything, or they're too fearful, they're too shut down. Whatever it may be. So then we often have to turn to negative reinforcement in order to kind of get through to the dog and open them up a little bit for learning. But so when we talk about negative reinforcement, we start talking about what we call escape and avoidance learning. So negative reinforcement by definition is to apply an aversive, something that is unpleasant to the dog, in order to get the dog to change its behavior so we can remove the aversive, thereby reinforcing the dog for doing the right thing. And that's where people go, holy shit, Stian, that does not make any sense at all, because making a dog feel uncomfortable in order to get them to do something, how on earth can that be reinforcing? So, the easiest way that I've found to describe this, and there are many, many ways of describing it, but as a clear concept, I think the idea of talking about seatbelts is probably the easiest way for most people to grasp the concept. So, here's the thing. Say you go out one day and you jump in your car and you fire up your car and you think to yourself, well, do you know what? I'm just going 100 meters down the road. Fuck it. I'm not going to put my seatbelt on today. Then you start the car, you back out of the driveway, you start driving. Now, what happens is the car applies an aversive pressure to you. The car starts beeping. Ding, 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 ding. Right? A sound that's unpleasant and annoying. And so now now the car is putting pressure on you in order to encourage you to change your behavior, to motivate you to change your behavior. So as the dinging persists, you get to a point where you go, oh my God, I can't listen to this anymore. Now you pull over to the side, you grab the seatbelt and you click it in, which stops the dinging. So by changing your behavior at this point, what you've done is you've actually reinforced the behavior of putting your seatbelt on. right? Now, negative reinforcement, like I said before, is referred to as escape and avoidance training as well. So, what happens in the early stages of negative reinforcement is we learn to escape the pressure. So, the car starts beeping, that is unpleasant. Um, if we didn't know that that was a signal to put our seatbelt on, we might be flailing a little bit. We might be pressing some buttons. We might be, stopping the car. We're trying to find out what it is that actually creates the escape response. Eventually, we would get to a point where we grab the seatbelt and we clip it in, and the beeping stops, and we go, that was the correct behavior. Yeah. So now we've learned to escape the discomfort of the pressure of the dinging of the car. Now, the next day, you come out again and you jump in your car and you're absent-minded, so you just fire up the car and the car immediately starts beeping because you haven't put your seatbelt on. Now we much quicker escape the discomfort, the aversive pressure that is being applied to us. And we grab the seatbelt and we clip it in as quickly as possible. The beeping stops. We escape the pressure one more time. Now, the purpose of negative reinforcement-based training is to get to a point where the dog doesn't have to feel, or the human or the dog, I should say, the subject doesn't have to feel the pressure whatsoever. So the way that that looks like in the car situation is after 3-4 days of negative reinforcement learning, what happens is you now walk out to the car, you sit down, you clip your seatbelt in before you even start the car. Now you hit avoidance because you're avoiding feeling the pressure altogether. And that's negative reinforcement. So when we talk about negative reinforcement training in dog training, we talk a lot about pressure and release. Right now, I'm going to be talking so much about negative reinforcement down the track because negative reinforcement is one of those things that is so important to understand, but so few people seem to understand properly, even professional trainers. So we'll be getting into much more of this, but think of it this way. If I was going to teach a child to cross the road safely, right? Now I want to teach the child to conduct a behavior, which is cross the road safely. It's a new skill that I'm trying to teach the child that has never had this experience before. Now, there's two ways, really, at this point that I can do that. I can hold out an ice cream and I can slowly walk over the road, trying to encourage that child to follow me, hoping they won't get distracted in the process. Once we get to the other side, I then give them the ice cream for job well done, new behavior acquired. Or we can do what most people would do is we'd use a combination of negative and positive reinforcement. So what I would do is I would grab the child's arm, hold it in my hand, apply a little bit of pressure, not crushing the child's hand, like just a little bit of tightening to kind of say, to give the child a signal, hey, I need you to pay attention. I need you to follow me at this point. Then I would start walking, and by default, the child would follow me because I still have applied the pressure. Then we continue walking until we get to the other side of the road. I will now let go of the child's hand, and then I will give them an ice cream. So now what we're doing is we're utilizing some form of compulsion or pressure to very quickly show the child, hey, this is dangerous. I really need you to do this effectively, efficiently, and quickly. But then at the end of it, there's going to be a double reward because I'm going to let go of your hand, let go of the pressure that I was applying to your hand, and I'm going to follow up with an ice cream, which is hopefully something the child likes. So again, So many people mistake the use of pressure and negative reinforcement. They mistake that for just automatically being punishment. But at the end of the day, what operant conditioning teaches us is that reinforcement can only ever start behavior and punishment can only ever stop behavior. In the case of both being in the car and putting your seatbelt on or teaching a child to walk safely across the road, these are all behaviors we're teaching to the individual. Therefore, it's reinforcement based. But it's reinforcement based with pressure to create a bigger consequence, to enhance the subject understanding of how important this actually is. So please don't mistake any form of pressure type use for automatically being punishment. That's what the internet wants you to think these days because they are claiming that positive reinforcement can do anything. That is unfortunately simply not the case because, again, positive reinforcement can only start a behavior, it can never stop anything. And this is where a lot of the arguments happen. But again, we're here to learn about the science, not about the arguments. So, positive reinforcement, add something appetitive, something pleasant in order to make a behavior more likely to happen again. Positive punishment, add something aversive in order to make the behavior less likely to happen again. Negative reinforcement, add something unpleasant in order to make a behavior more likely to happen again. And finally, negative punishment, take away something pleasant in order to make a behavior less likely to happen again. Again, this is all nerd stuff. I didn't come up with any of this, right? But I have to use the correct terms in order to explain to you what is actually going on. Hopefully, that has made things a little bit clearer, despite the fact that I've been talking about this for like 25 minutes now. Hopefully, it makes a little bit more sense. As you can probably tell by now, if you haven't listened to this podcast, I do like going very in depth and I do like talking a lot. And I apologize for that, but I want people to really be clear on what these things are because they are important to understand if we're going to make true long-lasting learning happen in our dogs. All right, if you're still with me, congratulations. We are through the most heavy lifting type work now. We'll get into some things that are a little bit easier, and I'm not going to be talking about each thing for about 20-25 minutes, hopefully. But kudos on you for sticking around. So, the next thing I want to talk about is what we call the ABCs of dog training. And ABC stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So once we have all of this baseline knowledge, now we start putting this together. So antecedent, for those of you who don't know, is essentially just a signal. It is some kind of signal that cues the dog into conducting a specific behavior. And then after the behavior is conducted, there will be a consequence. So if I say sit, and again, this is, I have to have trained the sit beforehand, right? But now I ask my dog to sit, the dog then changes its behavior. Now, at this point, you have a correct and an incorrect behavior, which is gonna decide what the consequence at the end of it is. So I say sit, my dog puts his bum on the ground, I give the dog a reinforcer. I throw the ball, I throw a piece of food, I say, yes, good boy, and we wrestle for a bit, whatever that may be for the dog. Now, if I say sit and my dog drops, now the consequence is going to be punitive because the dog didn't complete the specific behavior that I was asking for. So I say I say sit, my dog drops, and I can administer some form of punishment to tell the dog, hey, that was not the right thing to do. Go back into the correct behavior, right? And so that might be, I say no, I give a little tap on the e-collar, or if the dog's on a leash, I can give a little pop on the leash. The dog should then, if it understands that sit means put your bum on the ground, the dog should then immediately pop up into the correct behavior because I punished the incorrect response, meaning I can then follow up with the reinforcement afterwards. So ABC, antecedent, leads to behavior, behavior leads to consequence, either reinforcing or punishing. Now, we have something that we call extinction bursts. And an extinction burst is essentially a rapid increase in a particular behavior that a dog or human is expecting some form of reinforcement out of because they've had reinforcement in the past. So, my favorite example is to just think of a light switch somewhere in your house. So say you're walking around the house, you're getting ready to leave, whatever. You're getting dressed, and then you go, oh, I forgot something in this room, but it's getting a little bit dark because you're going out, right? And you walk into that room, you open the door, you flick the light switch. Now you're expecting an outcome at this point. You're expecting the room to light up. However, if that room does not light up, now what happens is we almost immediately move into an extinction burst. So now I flick the switch again, flick, 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 and I do that quicker and quicker and quicker, 3, 4, 5 times, and then I go, it's not working. And so an extinction burst, again, is when you've had reinforcement from a behavior, meaning you flick the switch, the light comes on, that's reinforcing because you can see what's happening around you. Suddenly, that doesn't produce the reinforcement you were expecting again. We tend to intensify the behavior in order to try and get the result we were expecting. Now, extinction bursts happen in dogs a lot, especially when we're dealing with behavior modification. Because if a dog has conducted a specific behavior, and again, it doesn't matter where that behavior came from, whether it came from fear, whether it came from accidental reinforcement, none of these things matter. What matters is that the dog is expecting a specific outcome for conducting a specific behavior. Now, if we then step in, if this is an undesirable behavior, what we do is we step in and we find a way of blocking access to that reinforcement. And so now the dog goes, well, shit, this has worked in the past. I'm going to try harder. And it tries harder. It intensifies. It gets worse and worse and worse and worse. Then the extinction burst comes when the dog gives up. That's an important thing to know because that is something we sometimes use in training. I want to talk quickly about methods of teaching. So there's a couple of different ways we can teach a dog a behavior, right? If I want to teach my dog to sit, there's essentially 3 ways. There's 3 ways really, but there's 4 at the end of the day. So I can use something we call luring. So luring means, I like to refer to luring as puppy fishing, because this is the point where I put a treat, a stinky, nice, yummy treat in my hand. I put that in front of the dog's nose, and the dog's automatically going to start following my hand. Now, at this point, I can guide the dog into any shape or into any position that I want them to, because I'm controlling the dog's head. If you're controlling the dog's head, you're controlling the dog's entire body. So now the dog is following the treat that's in my hand. And as the dog comes closer to me, I lift my hand up. That's going to move the head up. When the head goes up, the bum is automatically going to go down. Bum hits the ground. I say the word sit. I give the treat. So this is what we call luring. We can guide the dogs up on different surfaces. We can guide them into different positions. And when they hit the right position, we then give them the reinforcer, the food in this case, in order to teach them, hey, this is something that I actually want you to do and something that I like you doing. Now, the flip side, the negative reinforcement based version of that. So luring is positive reinforcement because the dog's following something that it wants in order to get into a specific position. Now, with what we call guiding, what we do, guiding or pressure-based training, I guess, is now we're doing the negative reinforcement-based aspect of teaching a new behavior. So instead of having a treat in my hand and lifting it over the dog's head, what I might do now is I might clip a leash to the dog's collar and I pull up on that leash. Now, when I pull up on that leash, there's a little bit of tension around the dog's neck. And the dog goes, well, this is kind of annoying. I want this to stop happening. And so the dog begins offering behaviors in order to try and get it to stop. Now, sometimes they might try to spin around. They might, try to walk backwards. They'll offer all these behaviors to go like, hey, this annoying thing on my neck, how do I make that stop? But eventually, most dogs, with upwards pressure on the leash, their bum's going to hit the ground. The second it does, I release tension on the leash. And now the dog goes, aha, bum on the ground. That was the correct behavior. That's what took away the aversive pressure. And so that's what we generally refer to as guiding. Then we have what we call free shaping. Free shaping is when I give the dog no direction except rewarding them for every little step closer to the correct behavior. So if I want my dog to sit, but I'm not going to help them or guide them in any way, what I might do is I might sit down with a handful of treats. I show the dog that I've got a treat. That's something the dog wants. But I don't tell the dog, and again, like when I say tell, I don't mean say the word sit, because obviously the dog doesn't know the word at this point. But I don't help them in any way to get into the right position. I just sit there and I look at them and I wait. Now the dog goes, hey, I want the thing that you've got. How do I get you to give it to me? And at this point, the dog will start offering you behaviors. They might spin in a circle. They might bark at you. They might try to jump on you, right? And you just ignore them. Because eventually what's going to happen is the dog's going to put its bum on the ground. You say yes or give your marker word. We'll get more into what marker training is at some other point. But you tell the dog, yes, that was the correct thing to do, and then you offer them the reinforcement. Then the dog gets a little bit confused. They're like, oh, what actually happened there? Why did that happen? Because I tried so many behaviors. And so now the dog might start cycling through some more behaviors, but they should get to the right behavior quicker, which in this case is sitting. When they sit, you say yes, or you click and you give them the food. Before long, the dog is going to go, oh, I know what this guy wants when he brings out food. It's for me to put my bum on the ground. And now we can start adding a word to the behavior. So that's what we call free shaping. We call it free shaping because we're giving the dog the freedom to shape themselves into a specific behavior. It's a cool way of training. It does take a hell of a lot of time. Because the dog has to make a lot of mistakes before they get it right in most cases. But if you have the time and the patience, or you need to teach them something very complex, that is the way to do it. Then finally, we have spatial pressure. Now, a lot of people might argue that spatial pressure isn't really a method by which we teach something specific. Because it's not very directional, it's not very clear to the dog. But essentially what spatial pressure is a negative reinforcement-based training where I walk towards the dog, right? So if I have a dog standing in front of me and I want to teach them to walk backwards, well, the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to take a step towards the dog. I'm getting into the dog's space, and the dog finds that I'm a little bit too close, so they're going to naturally take a step back. At that point, when they take a step back, I can say yes and encourage that behavior. Now I take 2 steps towards them. Dog takes 2 steps back. And at this point, I'm using my body to actually spatially move the dog thereby starting a cycle of behavior that I can then reinforce. All right, if you're still with me, kudos to you. I know this stuff is a little bit heavy, but hopefully it's all starting to make sense because it is going to be important moving forward to really understand this so we can speak to our dogs as efficiently as possible. The last couple of things that I want to talk about is one thing that we call counter conditioning. So, counter conditioning is when a dog has essentially taught itself a behavior that we don't like. And this behavior is usually based on another stimulus. So, say, for example, you have a dog that's scared of other dogs. When that dog sees another dog, it may react in an aggressive manner. It might lunge, it might bark, in order to try and drive the other dog away, which then takes away pressure off the dog, which then produces a negative reinforcement based learning experience where the dog goes, hey, dog came close to me. I started experiencing stress. I used aggressive behavior towards that dog. The dog ran away. I now feel safe again. Now, at this point, the dog's essentially, I believe I spoke about this in the last one, but now the dog gets stuck in what we call a self reinforcement cycle, where they go, hey, I feel unsafe. I react in an aggressive manner. The other thing goes away. I start to feel safe again. And this is where we want to go into a process of what we call counter conditioning. Now, counter conditioning essentially means I'm going to counter condition the response that you've already conditioned yourself into. So when a dog reacts to another dog, I might correct them in some way, form, or shape with the leash to interrupt that behavior. So the dog sees another dog, it immediately lunges and barks because that's the natural response that the dog has taught itself. Now, if I then introduce some form of aversive pressure, the dog is very quickly going to stop its behavior and it's going to go like, what the hell is this? And it's going to start paying attention to the pressure that I'm applying to the dog. Now the dog's going to change its behavior, at which point the pressure goes away. So the dog learns reacting in this particular manner is a bad thing. Being calm in the situation you would normally be over aroused or reactive in is a good thing. Now what happens is I've opened the dog up for learning. So now the dog looks at the other dog but doesn't react. I click and the dog looks back to me and gets a treat. And so what I'm doing over time is I'm trying to make the dog alter its initial behavior to the stimuli, thereby countering the original behavior that the dog taught itself. So again, it's basic conditioning, but we're countering the conditioning that the dog's taught itself, and we're countering it into a new and more desirable behavior. Now, this comes alongside with something we call desensitization. So a dog that has, say, for example, had a bad experience with another dog, might have been in a fight with them, might have been attacked, they might perceive another dog as a threat to them. And that's very often where the reactive aggressive behavior begins because the dog's like, hey, I don't feel safe here. I'm going to be aggressive towards you in order to try to get you to go away. If the dog at that point goes away, the dog thinks my aggressive behavior worked and we begin a behavioral cycle. Now, a dog with a low tolerance for stress tends to overreact to a lot of things. And so at this point, we want to begin a process of desensitization alongside a counter conditioning process. So I want to teach the dog, hey, actually, other dogs aren't bad. They're good because they lead to a good thing coming from me. But now the dog might still be stressed in the situation that he is in. But for the longer we stay in that situation without anything bad happening to the dog desensitizes over time. Meaning desensitization is also referred to as habituation. So the dog gets more and more used to being in a particular setting without reacting in a particular way. And so essentially they neutralize to the environment around them. And again, when I get stuck into some puppy development talk and that kind of stuff, you'll hear me talk a lot about neutrality. Because at the end of the day, I want a dog that sees another dog, another person, someone in a wheelchair, a fast motorcycle, a plane flying over a tram, whatever it may be. And that dog looks at that thing and goes, oh, there's a thing, couldn't give a shit. And they just move on with their lives. At the end of the day, what we want from our dogs is to be neutral, to be confident, and to be excited about being with us and not overly excited about everything else around them. Finally, um, I'm going to talk about a thing that's called flooding. Now, flooding isn't so much a direct learning opportunity, but it is an important thing to talk about, I think. So, flooding is essentially we flood the dog with some form of stimuli, and then we wait for them to neutralize to stop reacting to it or to stop being afraid of it, whatever it may be. And then the idea is that that opens the dog up for learning and curiosity towards the thing that freaked them out. Now, flooding is a very controversial topic, and it's something I ideally don't want to do because you really need to control the situation very well in order to not make the problem worse. So to give an example to people out there, say for example, you're scared of spiders and you come to me in order to get help with your arachnophobia. Well, first of all, that would be a terrible idea because I have no idea how to help people with their arachnophobia. But at some point, what I need to do is I need to present you with the spider. And again, I want to keep you in a counter conditioning and desensitization process. So I might show you a spider from 5 meters away. Now, the spider is far enough away from you for you to not immediately have an overt reaction and jump up and start screaming, right? So you sit there, you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but if you don't react in a panicking manner, I'm going to remove the spider away and you're going to feel better. That's going to be the negative reinforcement aspect. And over time, we can start bringing the spider closer and closer. And every time you don't react, I remove the spider. That makes you feel safer. And then I give you a piece of chocolate, right? That's the kind of conditioning. So now every time you see a spider, you think, oh, if I remain calm, it's nothing to worry about. Really, I get a piece of chocolate. Now, with flooding, the process then would essentially be putting you in a room full of spiders. And that is a complicated thing to deal with, right? Now, flooding it's important to talk about and it's important to understand. It's not something that I use as a method, as an active method of training. But I do have so many dogs that come to me that are so incredibly fearful and shut down that if I leave the house, I'm flooding them. And so now what do? Well, I can't can condition dog. I can't desensitize them because if anything happens to them, they're flooded, right? And so I think that's why it's important to understand the process of flooding because sometimes we cannot avoid it. And again, what you need if you're doing flooding is you need to have very good handling skills. You need to be very neutral in the presence of the other stimuli because you have to kind of feed that neutral energy into the dog as much as possible. And you have to be incredibly patient. You just have to sit there. If it takes 20 minutes, if it takes 2 hours, it doesn't matter. You just kind of have to sit there. Not babying the dog, not talking to him, not saying, it'll be fine, good boy, good boy, right? But you want to be just completely neutral. And you want to wait for the dog to find that neutrality themselves. And then you can start moving into the counter conditioning process. So now you can say good boy and give them a pat or give them a treat. But flooding is a tough one. But unfortunately, in some cases, it's completely unavoidable, which is why we should not be talking about this stuff. Some people say you should never flood a dog, but that's not helpful. If I have a dog that I can't take anywhere without flooding, right? Well, I can lock that dog in the house for the rest of my life and just take it to the backyard to go to the toilet. But what kind of life is that for the dog, right? And so these are the areas that are complex behavioral issues where we actually have to really understand this stuff in order to be able to help our dogs through them, rather than just ignoring them and saying that's not an option. All right. If you're still with me, I salute you. Look, I know this stuff it's kind of heavy, and but like I keep saying, it is important to understand. I know a lot of trainers out there that kind of just give step by step guides to people, like, hey, when the dog does this, do that, and I don't really do that because I want people to understand why they're doing things, and the only way we can understand or the only way I can explain to people why they're doing something is by first explaining to them why the dog is doing what the dog is doing. So kudos to you if you stuck around for this whole time. I am finished now. I promise I won't bore you anymore. But hopefully this kind of gives you a little bit of a clearer sense of how we approach dog training in so many different ways. And depending on the dog in front of us, we have options, right? If I have a dog that doesn't want to take food, well, if all you do is positive reinforcement food training, then you hit a ceiling very quickly. Whereas if you then go, well, there are other ways I can motivate you, that could be through play, that could be through a little bit of leash pressure, right? Now suddenly we're opening ourselves up to help even the dogs that a lot of other trainers can't help. And that's why this stuff is so important. Again, thank you so much for sticking around. Hope I didn't bore you too much. Um, I'm Stian Helling. My company is Beautiful Beast Dog Training. If you want to get in touch with me, the easiest way to do that is to either jump on my website, beautifulbeasts.com.au, and send me an email through there. You can find us on social media. We're on uh, oh god, we're on Instagram and Facebook under Viking Dog Trainer. I am working on setting up a YouTube as well, and that is also Viking Dog Trainer. There's not a whole lot going on there yet because I'm in the process of filming a bunch of stuff. But there is also a Patreon coming. I do have a new puppy coming, which is very exciting, and I'm gonna put up a Patreon where I'm essentially going to show everyone how I raise a puppy from the day I get them into becoming what I call a Viking dog. So jump onto there. I'll probably let you know what the link to that is in the next episode because I'm still trying to work out how Patreon works. But yeah, follow us on social media. If you have questions, email me or send me a message. If you like this, please share it with someone that you think might find it valuable as well. Rate and review it. I know that actually makes more people see it because it algorithm, blah, blah, blah. I don't know anything about that, but I know that it is important. So if you enjoy this, please take the time to leave a review and a comment. Aside from that, as I always say, now go train your dogs.